And for the first time, in innovation, we basically entered the top 40 countries, recently. In 2019, we entered the top 50 economies. When you put it all together, there are potential, headwinds and potential tailwinds. And we did not become such a stellar economy by following the socialist model. If anything, by following the socialist model from 1947 to 1991, we really lagged behind. While other countries, East Asian economies, South Korea, Singapore, all of these countries grew.
What gives you the confidence, and what's behind so in fact, if I could just use a kind of slightly negative thing, but it doesn't mean negative, is that it's such a rosy picture. Aren't you not worried? And what gives you the confidence to come out and predict that India would have a GDP of, I think, 55 trillion is what you're saying by 2040 at its 100th birthday, India at 100. That's the name of the book. So, what is behind this bravado, if I may say?
This outcome hinges on whether we can grow at 8%, from now on till. And in the book, of course, I've portrayed other scenarios as well. Even if we grow at 7%, but take into account the fact that the lower inflation will mean lower depreciation, we'll be close to 40 trillion. Actually 40 trillion. And in contrast, if we grow only at 6%, then we'll be 30 trillion. So there are other scenarios that have been, So if some of the risks that may manifest, it's possible that, growth may be lower. But 8% is something which is ambitious, but I think it is achievable, especially given the demography we have, the kind of, policies that have been implemented over the last 10 years, the public digital infrastructure, the innovation, the entrepreneurship. In contrast, in India, anywhere between 2/3 to 3/4 of our economy is informal. And informal sectors are far less productive. Informal sector firms are far less productive than formal sector firms. So the emphasis on formalization that is happening through the public digital infrastructure will be a key driver of productivity improvement. And for the first time, in innovation, we basically entered the top 40 countries, recently. In 2019, we entered the top 50 economies. So these will drive productivity improvements in the formal sector as well. So that's when you put it all together. There are potential, headwinds and potential tailwinds.
You have spoken of this as a once-in-a-century opportunity. I was just wondering, what makes it a once-in-a-century? Of course, we have a lot of, like you said, the demographic dividend and the kind of opportunities we have right now as a fast-growing nation. But why a once-in-a-century? Is there in particular coming together of a lot of factors?
I didn't say once in a century. I said once in a few centuries opportunity. Because right. if we indeed grow at 8%, we'll be a $55 trillion economy. In which case we will be rubbing shoulders with the top economy of that time. The last time India was of a similar, very, very similar size, to a top economy was in the 13th or 14th century. If you recall, in the 2020 economic survey, we had shown this chart from the book by Angus Madison, where India accounted for at least 1/3 of world's GDP consistently for every century up until 1750 AD. We had, our economy being sort of the largest in the world. Was around the 13th, 14th century. So we could be, the second largest economy, or maybe very, very similar in size to the largest economy. That the last time that happened was, centuries back, and that's why this is a once in a few centuries opportunity.
But what are the factors that right now contribute to it? Like you mentioned, the demographic dividend, but that could also turn into a demographic curse, say 30, 40 years down the line. But besides that, what are these other factors which you could maybe point out for us, which contribute to this?
As I explained, the first is the formalization of the economy, where informal sector firms actually come into the formal sector and thereby become far more productive. I think you have to remember that growth comes from two key things. One is investment, and second is productivity. productivity improvements. So investment, we have to maintain about 35% of GDP investment. That's that's what in the second chapter, where I'm actually projecting endogenously the growth across, using various models. As the C. Rangarajan model, looking at growth across sectors. Then the Robert Solow model, modeling the entire economy as as one, and also historical estimations, doing these different, looking at the investment rate and the productivity growth. So one of the key drivers is productivity growth from formalization, informal sector firms becoming formalized. Second, as I mentioned earlier, given the significant improvements that have happened in innovation and entrepreneurship, today we are the third largest entrepreneurial ecosystem in the world. And for the first time, as I said, in 2019, we entered the top 50 innovating economies, and recently, we entered the top 40 innovating countries. If you look at the recent budget, the 1 trillion, it was there in the interim budget, but 1 trillion rupee, 1 lakh crores of long-term funding for innovation, together with the with the NRF that has been established, the National Research Foundation. These will enable innovation. So innovation and entrepreneurship will lead to productivity improvements even among formal sector firms, who still have a long way to catch up with the formal sector firms internationally. At the same time, the public digital infrastructure, I think, is a very important. And if you would have observed, I've actually laid out in the in the I think it's the fourth chapter, where the economic strategy, it's a 4-pillared strategy, where
Right, but,
the first pillar is macroeconomic focus on economic growth. Second pillar is actually social and economic inclusion, and third pillar is ethical wealth creation.
I'm pretty curious about the third pillar, actually. I'm pretty curious about the third pillar, because you've made given such an big importance to ethical, money making. Why exactly is that, and what makes it so important?
And we did not become such a stellar economy by following the socialist model, nor have we become actually the 5th largest economy now, after 1991, by following the socialist model. If anything, by following the socialist model from 1947 to 1991, we really lagged behind, while other countries, East Asian economies, South Korea, Singapore, all of these countries grew. And the last point I want to actually, talk about, people, and especially though, in the media, we write about the wealth and, of many people. I want to say, it's not, whether it's actually somebody who's wealthy individual X or wealthy individual Y, they're not stacking rupee bills in their mattresses, or they're not putting it on their in their bed. And I say this with full conviction, because I've never done any consulting for anybody. Actually, I'm just saying as a conceptual point, their wealth is actually invested in companies which provide jobs, and that is really important. The fact that wealth creation has actually led to job creation has been demonstrated. We've demonstrated there's ample evidence both within India and across across the world. Wealth creation needs to be respected. Wealth creators need to be respected.
But are these wealth creators stepping up to that task? Because you've talked about, and the government is talking about, the virtuous cycle of investment.
I've given you the evidence, no?
You have mentioned that, but I'm just wondering, in practical terms, is it actually happening? Because we've seen a huge dearth of jobs, and in fact, the present budget also addressed it to some extent, admitting that there is an issue of jobs. So what exactly is happening? What is missing there?
So here again, actually, in my opinion, the narrative on employment has actually run far ahead of the actual data. A lot of the negative narratives on employment have come from the the CMI data. So using the CLEMS database, if you look at the RBI report, what does it show? It shows that over the last 10 years, 12.5 crores of jobs have been created from over the last 10 years. And even if we exclude agriculture, 9 crore jobs have been created. So, I think the point is, many times we in the media, we resort to these binaries. I think it is important that just because the government is emphasizing, it needs to emphasize, because we have a young population, and we need to, even if we have created 9 crore jobs over the last 10 years, we have to continue creating that many number of jobs. And in fact, we do more on this front. So rather than talk about just because the government is working on employment creation, that does not mean that jobs have been not been created. And I think the data shows it very, very clearly. Also, as I just mentioned, over the last 30-year period, if you correlate wealth creation with employment, there's been actually significant. Look at so many sectors. People like me, I started working in the software industry. I worked in financial services. None of this would have happened actually but for wealth creation.
You have mentioned that you've kind of mentioned in the last 2011 to 2020, many of the the slowdown before the COVID that we saw before COVID could all be originated back to the crony bank lending. In fact, that's one kind of a sole reason kind of thing which you've given, which I must maybe, if I could point out that there were the other factors like demonetization and a lot of other things which contributed to. That's one question. But of course, the main thing is this. The thing I wanted to get into it was looking forward. You've made a very, very very confident and very promising, optimistic outlook to the India's future. What could actually trip it, in the sense that could a regime change, could a different kind of economic policy coming in? What kind of a danger is there? Because of course we know external shocks, wars, those kind of things, oil prices. That's of course there. But inside the country, on a governmental level, policy level, what are the dangers it faces? Comparing it to what you mentioned the last 10 years, if the bank lending or that was one of the primary issues, if that is the case, then going forward, what are the big dangers internally to this success story or growth story going wrong?
So firstly, as many people mention about demonetization, I want to point out there is this Quarterly Journal of Economics paper by my colleague at the International Monetary Fund, Geeta Gopinath. They tried very hard to find the effect of demonetization on growth. They find no such effect. So, right. I think, it is time that we actually let the data speak there. If they had found the impact of, at the macro level, so in order to actually write that paper, they go and try across sectoral level, because they don't find anything at the macro level. So I think, rather than going by just anecdotal accounts, we should be respecting, careful empirical evidence. I've said this multiple times, but people sort of bring up this again and again based on anecdotal accounts. Now, see, from the perspective of what are the risk factors, I think in the preface to the book itself, I've actually covered this. What is important is good policies. In the last 10 years, we've had good economic policy, starting from the over 500 million bank accounts, and that enabled us to do the Jam Trinity, the IBC, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, the way we dealt with COVID, both on the health front and on the economic front, rather than mimicking advanced economies, which is what, copy pasting. And I've devoted one full chapter to actually talking about the pitfalls of copy paste, like we did during the global financial crisis. We must be using deep economic thinking, but at the same time, a very good awareness of the Indian economic landscape, Indian economic conditions. People sitting, for instance, I'm now almost in the last 2 years, actually, I'm living in the United States. People who live in the United States and then basically come on, for let's say a few days on a vacation, they do not have such a good understanding, or for that matter, they come on visits, do not have as good an understanding of the Indian economic landscape as one has when you live here. At the same time, those who live here also need to be very, very, aware that there is a world out there actually where other countries, what they are doing, a global perspective is incredibly important. So the combination of both of this is what is required for policy. We should not be using, India is different, to actually as an excuse to not think deeply, about economic aspects. Economic trade-offs remain the same, but at the same time, not just cut paste what other advanced economies did. For instance, I've talked about the fiscal policy. I've given that example in the preface itself. The Maastricht Treaty for Europe basically said, requires countries to keep fiscal deficit at 3% of GDP and debt to GDP at 66%. And our FRBM Acts, we just cut pasted that without accounting for the fact that India is a very different stage of development where the sovereign has to create public goods, be it digital public goods, physical public goods, or human capital, public goods. And at the same time, our growth potential is also much higher than that of Europe. And yet we did cut paste without taking into account some of these very important aspects. So I think the key risk is actually not implementing good economic policies. And that is why, and I want you to definitely, include this in the final text, which is that is why across 27 chapters, I've actually laid out what we need to do, on each aspect, whether it is actually on infrastructure creation, on human capital, on digital, infrastructure. I've covered across the board what we need to implement as policies. And that is, so that is just to emphasize the importance of good economic policy.
Thank you so much for your time.
Sure.
Thank
you. Bye.